It is a curious circumstance, and one that I have often reflected upon in the years since, that a man may sit within a few yards of a murder, may hear with his own ears the very report of the pistol that accomplishes it, and yet carry home nothing but the memory of an agreeable evening at the play. Such was my own position upon the night of the 19th of November, in the year 1896, and I confess it with no small measure of professional chagrin. That I did not perceive the crime is perhaps forgivable, for it was contrived with a cunning that deceived a theatre full of Londoners, and baffled the officials of Scotland Yard for the better part of a week. That my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes, seated at my very elbow, likewise heard the shot and thought nothing of it in the moment. This is a fact he was never afterwards eager to have recalled to him, and I set it down here only because the truth of the affair depends upon it. The month had been a wretched one. A fog had settled upon the city in the first days of November, and had shown no inclination to depart, so that the gas lamps of Baker Street burned all day as brown smears upon a yellow sky, and the traffic in the Marylebone Road went past our windows muffled and spectral, the very hoofs of the cab horses seeming to fall upon wool. Holmes had been without a case of any consequence for the better part of a fortnight, and I have remarked elsewhere upon the effect that idleness produced in that singular temperament. He had taken to lying upon the sofa from breakfast until dusk, the shag tobacco smoldering in the black clay pipe, saying nothing, until the very air of our sitting-room grew thick and blue, and I was driven to fling up the window to the fog, which was scarcely an improvement. It was in this humor that I at last prevailed upon him to accompany me to the theatre. I had read in the Morning Post that the Corinthian, in the Strand, was drawing full houses with a new romantic drama entitled The Wager of Honor *, and that the piece was chiefly remarkable for the performance of Miss Eleanor Vane, whose portrayal of the wronged heroine was said to have moved hardened critics to tears. Holmes had at first waved the proposal aside with the back of his hand, as he waved aside most proposals that promised sentiment. But towards evening, whether from the sheer weariness of his own idleness or from some private design of his own that I did not then suspect, he rose abruptly, knocked out his pipe against the fender, and declared that he would go. "There is generally more to be learned in a theatre than upon the stage, Watson," said he, drawing on his coat. "A crowd of 1,000 persons, each imagining himself unobserved, is as instructive a spectacle as any playwright ever devised. Come, we shall be late." I had, at the time, taken this for one of his epigrams, uttered for the pleasure of the phrase. I have since had cause to wonder whether Holmes did not go to the Corinthian that night with a purpose he had not confided to me, but if so, he never afterwards acknowledged it, and I have learned not to press him upon such matters. The Corinthian was, and I believe remains, one of the handsomer of the smaller houses in that quarter, a building of some 50 years' standing, with a portico of Corinthian columns from which it took its name, and an interior of crimson plush and tarnished gilt that had about it a faded, comfortable grandeur, like a dowager in an old gown. The fog had thinned a little by the hour of our arrival, but it hung still about the lamps of the portico, and the patrons came up out of it in twos and threes, the ladies with their skirts held clear of the wet pavement, the gentlemen stamping and turning up their collars, so that the vestibule was crowded and steaming and loud with talk when we passed within. I had secured, at some trouble, 2 seats in the stalls, well forward and a little to the left, from which we commanded an excellent view not only of the stage, but of the boxes that flanked the proscenium upon either side. It is upon these boxes that I must now dwell, for they are the very heart of the matter, and I shall be forgiven if I describe them with a particularity that seemed, at the time, quite without purpose. Upon each side of the stage, the Corinthian possessed a pair of private boxes, one above the other, curtained in the same crimson velvet that clothed the whole house. Those upon our own side, the left as one faced the stage, were empty that night, or nearly so. Those upon the opposite side, the right, or what I believe the theatrical people term the prompt side, were both occupied. The upper of the two held a party of young persons whom I took, from their laughter, to be of no great consequence to my narrative, and in this I was correct. The lower box, however, the one nearest the stage and level with it, so that its occupant sat scarcely a dozen feet from the players and somewhat below them, held a single man, and it is with that man that our tragedy begins. He was a person of perhaps 55 years, stout and florid, with a heavy face and heavy jowls, and a great expanse of white shirt front upon which a single diamond stud caught the light. He sat well back in his box, half in shadow, and I observed that the velvet curtain upon the side of the box nearer the stage, that is, the curtain that would have screened him from the players and from that portion of the house, had been partly drawn across, so that he was visible to us in the stalls but shielded from the boxes and the stage beyond. He had the air of a man accustomed to such a position, one who came to the theater not to see but to be seen, and yet who preferred, by some contradiction of temper, to keep a certain portion of himself in shadow. He did not applaud. He did not, so far as I observed, once smile. He sat through the first act with his heavy hands folded upon the rail before him and his heavy face turned towards the stage, and now and again a waiter brought him something in a glass, which he drank. "You are studying the gentleman in the stage box," said Holmes quietly, without turning his head. It was not a question. "I confess he interests me," said I. "There is something forbidding about him." "There is something a good deal more than forbidding," Holmes murmured. "But we shall let the play proceed." I asked him what he meant, but he would say no more, and the curtain rising upon the second act put an end to my curiosity for the time. I shall not weary the reader with the plot of the wager of honor, which was of the familiar romantic kind. A virtuous heroine, a villain of blackest dye, a noble but impoverished lover, and a tangle of honor and misunderstanding that could be resolved, in the manner of such pieces, only by a duel. Miss Vane was indeed remarkable. She was a woman of perhaps 30, dark and slender, with a voice that carried to the farthest gallery without seeming to be raised, and there was in her playing a quality of genuine and controlled passion that lifted the poor stuff of the drama far above its deserts. When, in the great scene of the second act, she came to plead with her lover to forego the duel that must, she was persuaded, cost him his life. The whole house was as still as a church, and I own that my own eyes were not entirely dry. The lover would not be moved. The villain, played by a florid, declamatory actor whose name I did not trouble to learn, strode upon the stage. There were words. The two men took their places back to back, then paced apart and turned. And here the piece departed from the usual convention, for the duel was fought not with the customary flourish and the two shots ringing out together, but with a single pistol. The two men, by the fantastic logic of the drama, having agreed to fire in turn, and the villain, being the challenged party, having the first fire. He raised his arm. Miss Vane, at the side of the stage, flung out her hands in a gesture of supplication and despair. And the pistol was fired. The report was very loud. It filled the whole house, and there was that little collective start and murmur that runs through an audience at such a moment, followed at once by the relieved settling that comes when the effect has been enjoyed. Upon the stage the lover stood a moment, swaying, and then, by the mercy of the dramatist, was seen to be unhurt, the villain having fired wide in his agitation, and the scene rushed on to its climax. I record now, with what exactness I can, the impression that the report made upon me, for it is the one true observation that I contributed to the whole affair, and I let it slip through my fingers like a fool. I have heard a great deal of gunfire in my life. I served in a campaign in which I heard it daily, and I do not think that any man who has once heard the report of firearms in earnest ever afterwards mistakes the sound. And in the instant of that pistol shot upon the Corinthian stage, some soldier's instinct in me, some faculty below the level of thought, remarked that the sound was not quite single. There was in it a fullness, a doubling, the merest suggestion of an echo that came not from the walls of the theater but from the sound itself, as though two reports had fallen so nearly together that the ear received them as one, and yet was troubled obscurely by the difference. I remember that I half turned my head. I remember that the impression faded even as I formed it, dismissed by my reason as a trick of the theater's acoustics, and that in another moment I was wholly absorbed once more in Miss Vane and her sorrows. I said nothing of it to Holmes. Had I done so, but a man may drive himself to distraction with such reflections, and I have long since ceased to indulge in them. The act ended. The curtain fell to loud applause, and the lights came up for the second interval, and the audience rose and stretched and began that shuffling migration towards the bars and the lobbies which is the true business of an English audience at the play. Holmes and I remained in our seats, he having declared that he had no wish to be trampled, and it was thus that we were still in the stalls, and well placed to observe everything, when the trouble began. It began quietly, as such things do. I became aware of a small knot of persons gathered before the door of the lower stage box upon the opposite side, the box in which the stout, florid gentleman had sat. There was a waiter, and a man in evening dress whom I did not then know, and an attendant in the livery of the theatre. And there was in their postures, even at that distance and across the emptying house, something that arrested my professional attention at once. I have seen too many men gathered about a hurt or a dying man not to know the attitude when I see it. "Holmes," said I, rising, "there is something amiss yonder." He was already upon his feet. We crossed the front of the stalls and mounted the little stair that led up to the boxes upon that side. And as we came to the door of the lower box, the man in evening dress turned to us a face that was pale and working with distress. "Is either of you gentlemen a medical man?" he cried. "For the love of heaven, we have sent for a doctor, but—" "I am a doctor," said I. "Let me pass." The box was small and dim, for the only light within it came from a single gas jet turned low and from the general illumination of the house beyond the half-drawn curtain. The stout gentleman sat as I had seen him sit throughout the evening, well back in his chair, his hands fallen now into his lap, his heavy head sunk a little forward upon his breast. For an instant, in that light, one might have taken him for a man asleep or overcome with wine. But I had been a doctor too long to be deceived by such an appearance, and when I laid my hand upon his shoulder and felt the peculiar inertness of it, and lifted his head and saw his face, I knew before I had well begun that the man was dead. "Bring the light nearer," said I, and the attendant, with trembling hands, unhooked the gas bracket upon its flexible arm and brought the flame close. I opened the dead man's coat. There was very little blood. That is a thing the untrained observer never expects, and it is the reason so many a mortal wound goes for a time unremarked. But upon the left of the great white shirt front, a little below and to the side of where the heart would lie, there was a small dark hole, scorched at its edges, and about it a spreading stain, dark upon the linen, and I knew that I was looking not upon the effect of any apoplexy or seizure, but upon the work of a bullet. "This man has been shot," said I. I heard behind me the sharp intake of Holmes's breath, and then his voice, very cool and quiet at my shoulder. "You are certain, Watson?" "There can be no doubt of it." "Here is the wound." "He has been shot through the body at close quarters. See the scorching, and death, I should think, was very nearly instantaneous. He can have made no sound. The ball has passed through or very near the heart." "And when?" said Holmes. "That I cannot tell you to the minute. But the body is barely cooled. Within the hour, certainly. Very possibly a good deal less." Holmes said nothing for a moment. He was standing quite still in the doorway of the box, and though the light was poor, I could see that his eyes were moving, over the dead man, over the chair, over the small round table at the dead man's elbow upon which stood a glass and a decanter and a flat leather dispatch case, over the curtains, the floor, the very ceiling of the little box, moving with that swift, minute, comprehensive attention that I had learned to recognize as the sign that his whole formidable engine of observation. "Within the hour," he repeated softly, "or a good deal less. Watson, do you recall the pistol shot in the duel scene?" I stared at him. And in that instant, the whole force of my own earlier impression came back upon me, and I understood, or began to understand. "Good God, Holmes," said I. "The doubling of the report." "You think, I think nothing yet," said he. "It is a capital mistake to think before one has one's facts. But I will tell you this, Watson, that we shall not, I fancy, be going home so early as we had hoped. The hour that followed was one of confusion, and I shall set down only so much of it as bears upon the case. The man in evening dress, it was he, I afterwards understood, who was the manager of the theater, though in the alarm of the moment I had not grasped his office, had gone very white at my pronouncement, and put out a hand to the door frame as though to steady himself. "Shot," he repeated in a whisper. "Shot here in my house. It is not possible. It cannot be. There has been no shot but the one upon the stage, sir. I heard it myself. He broke off and passed a hand across his brow and mastered himself with a visible effort. "Forgive me. I am not myself. What must we do? Tell me what must be done, and it shall be done." "You must send for the police at once," said I, "and you must see that this box is closed and that no person enters it until they come. Nothing here must be touched or moved. Yes. Yes, of course." He turned and gave his orders in a low, rapid voice to the attendant Tibbet and to the waiter, and I was struck, even in that moment, by the steadiness that came back into him once he had a thing to do. He was a man, I thought, more used to command than his first distress had suggested. The lights of the house were coming up, and out beyond the half-drawn curtain the great auditorium was filling with the murmur and shuffle of the returning audience, wholly unconscious of what had befallen within a dozen feet of the stage they had lately watched. It gave me an eerie sensation, I remember, to kneel there beside a murdered man in the little dim box, and to hear through the velvet the ordinary cheerful noise of 1,000 people settling to be amused. Holmes, meanwhile, had said nothing further, but had drawn back a little into the shadow of the box, where he stood with his hands behind him, and his chin sunk upon his breast, motionless, his eyes traveling ceaselessly over every particular of the scene. I knew that attitude of old, and I did not disturb it. Once only he spoke, and that was to the manager as the latter turned to go. "A moment, if you please. What is the dead gentleman's name?" The manager checked upon the threshold. "Crail, sir, Mr. Bartholomew Crail. He is a proprietor of this theater. One of the proprietors." And there was in the way he said it, in the little hesitation and the drop of the voice, something that I did not then interpret, but that I was afterwards to remember. "Thank you," said Holmes gravely. "That is all." The manager went, and presently there came the measured tread of a constable upon the stair, and then a police sergeant, a stolid, careful man who took one look at the body and at me, and had the good sense to touch nothing and to send at once for higher authority. A screen was got and set before the door of the box, and the audience, who had by now begun to sense that something was wrong, in the mysterious way that a crowd will, were kept at their distance by the constable, and the second half of asterisk the wager of honor asterisk was, of course, abandoned, and the great house emptied itself slowly and reluctantly into the fog, buzzing with rumor. And at length, summoned by the good sense of someone at the station who recognized in the affair something beyond the ordinary run of Saturday night trouble, there came bustling up the stairs the small, wiry, ferret-featured figure of Inspector Lestrade, whom I had not seen these several months, and who greeted Holmes with that mixture of relief and resentment which the sight of my friend always seemed to rouse in him. "Mr. Holmes, I might have known you would be here before me. Wherever there's trouble, well, and Dr. Watson. This is a bad business, gentlemen, a very bad business. A gentleman shot dead in his box in a full theater, and no one hears a thing, and no weapon to be found. I don't mind telling you, I don't like the look of it." "Nor I, Lestrade," said Holmes, "but for a different reason, I dare say. Do you know who the dead man is?" "That I do. His name was Bartholomew Crale. And if you know anything of the money that flows in and out of this part of London, Mr. Holmes, you'll know that name as well as I do." "Crale the financier," said Holmes. "The moneylender, yes. I know the name." Something in his voice made me glance at him, but his face was in shadow. "A hard man by all accounts," Lestrade went on, lowering his voice, "and one with a good many enemies, I shouldn't wonder. He owned a piece of this very theater, they tell me, and held paper over half the tradesmen in the Strand besides. If a man was ever ripe for murdering, this was the man. The trouble is going to be, Mr. Holmes, not finding who had a reason, but finding who had the chance. For here is a thing I don't understand at all." And he laid his finger, in the manner of a man producing his difficulty, upon the very knot of the matter. "Nobody entered this box. The attendant swears to it. The attendant, a gray-haired, respectable man named Tibbet, was brought forward, and repeated his account with the earnestness of a man who feels his own credit to be in question. He had, he said, been stationed the whole evening in the little curtained lobby that gave access to the two boxes upon that side. It was his particular charge. No person could reach either box save by passing him, and he was ready to swear upon the book that after Mr. Crale had gone in, at the beginning of the second act, no living soul had passed through to the lower box until the alarm was raised. The waiter had brought Mr. Crale his brandy, yes, but that was before the act began. During the act itself Tibbet had stood at his post, and not a soul had gone by. "You were at your post the whole time," said Holmes. "You did not leave it, even for a moment." The man hesitated, and a faint color came into his gray cheeks. "Once, sir. Once only. During the second act there was a disturbance in the gallery, a drunken fellow making a noise, and I was called up to help put him out, it being quiet on my own station with the act going forward. But I was gone no more than 3 or 4 minutes, sir, and the box door was closed when I left it and closed when I came back, and I'll take my oath no one came out of it in between, for I'd have met them on the stair. During the second act, Holmes repeated, "And can you tell me, Tibbet, at what point in the second act you were called away? Before the duel scene or after it?" The man's face showed his surprise at the question. "Why before, sir?" "A little before. The noise in the gallery started up, and I was fetched, and I mind that I heard the pistol go off in the play while I was up above there, dealing with the drunken man. So I was away, sir, at the very time the shot was fired on the stage." "Ah," said Holmes very softly. "Thank you, Tibbet. You have been most exact." I saw Lestrade look from the attendant to Holmes and back again with a puzzled frown, not perceiving, as I confess I did not yet fully perceive, the significance of what had been said. But I had known Holmes too long to mistake the note that had come into his voice, and I understood that in that halting testimony of the theater attendant, some cornerstone of the whole edifice had been quietly laid. The examination of the box itself occupied Holmes for the better part of half an hour, during which Lestrade and I stood by, and the theater officials hovered miserably in the lobby, and the body of Bartholomew Crail sat undisturbed in its chair, for Holmes had given strict instructions that nothing was to be moved until he had done. He went over the little chamber inch by inch. He examined the dead man's clothing and the wound with a care that even I, as a medical man, could not have bettered, and I heard him murmur to himself that the ball had entered from behind and a little to the left, ranging forward, a circumstance I had not myself remarked, and which I could not at first reconcile with the position of the chair. He examined the glass and the decanter, and pronounced that the brandy had not been tampered with. He turned his attention to the flat leather dispatch case upon the table, which he found to be unlocked and empty, save for a few papers of no consequence, and I observed that this emptiness appeared to interest him a good deal more than any fullness could have done. "A man such as Crail," said he, half to himself, "does not carry an empty case about with him to the theater. He carried something here, and it is gone. Note that, Lestrade. Whatever else the murderer came for, he did not leave without the contents of this case. But it was to the curtains of the box that he devoted his closest and his strangest attention. The box, as I have said, was hung with crimson velvet, and at its rear, dividing it from the little lobby where Tibbet kept his station, there fell a heavy curtain of the same stuff. Holmes drew this aside and examined the wall behind it with his lens, moving the flame of a wax vesta slowly along the wainscot, and presently I heard him give that little hiss of indrawn breath that with him did duty for a cry of triumph. "Watson, Lestrade, come here if you please." We came and crowded into the narrow space behind the curtain, and Holmes held the light to the wall. "What do you see?" "Paneling," said Lestrade. "Old paneling, painted over. Look more closely. Here and here." His long forefinger traced upon the wall a faint rectangular seam, running up from the floor to something above the height of a man's head, and across, and down again, the unmistakable outline of a doorway, papered and painted into the wall until it was all but invisible to the casual eye. "There was once a door here, Lestrade." A communicating door between this box and the box adjoining upon the far side. The box, you will observe, that stands empty tonight. It has been closed up, oh, these many years, by the look of the paint. Closed up and forgotten. He brought the light close to the lower edge of the seam. Forgotten by all the world, but not, I think, by everyone. For observe the paint along this edge. It is cracked. It is freshly cracked, Lestrade. The crack is clean and pale where the older surface is dulled and yellowed. And here upon the floor, he stooped and touched the boards and held up his fingertip to the light, and I saw upon it a fine gray dust. Here is plaster and paint newly fallen. This door, gentlemen, which the world believes to have been sealed for a generation, has been opened. It has been opened within the day. And it has been opened, I do not doubt, from the farther side. There was a silence in the little space behind the curtain. Then Lestrade said, in a voice from which all its earlier confidence had gone, "The empty box." You mean to say the murderer was in the empty box and came through the wall? I mean to say, said Holmes, straightening and dusting his fingers with great deliberation, that a man stood in that adjoining box in darkness, screened by the velvet, at his leisure and unobserved. That he had, before the performance, or upon some earlier day, quietly freed this old door of the paint and plaster that held it, so that at the chosen moment it might be opened without noise. That when the moment came, the moment, Lestrade, of the pistol shot upon the stage, he opened it and reached through, and fired into the back of Mr. Bartholomew Crail at a range of a very few feet, so that the two reports, the false upon the stage and the true within the box, fell together upon the ears of 1,000 people as a single sound. That he then closed the door, took from the table whatever it was he came to take, and withdrew through the empty box and away, at his leisure, while the whole house sat rapt before Miss Eleanor Vane. It was very well planned. It was planned by a man who knew this theater as he knew his own hand, who knew to the second when the shot upon the stage would come, and who knew that the one man whose business it was to watch that lobby would, by a happy chance or a careful arrangement, be called away at the very instant of the deed. It was, Lestrade, an admirable piece of work. I have not seen its like. I have set down Holmes's reconstruction here, at the point at which he made it, though in truth much of what gave it its final certainty was not established until later. But it is a fair record of the swiftness with which he had grasped the essential shape of the crime, and the days that followed were devoted not to discovering that shape, which he had seen almost from the first, but to fitting a man to it. It was upon the following morning that we sat down, in the sitting-room in Baker Street, to consider who that man might be. The fog had lifted at last, and a pale, cold sunlight lay upon the carpet, and Holmes, who had been abroad since before I rose, came in and flung himself into his chair with the air of a man who has been gathering harvest. I have been making the acquaintance of the late Mr. Crail, said he, or rather of his reputation, which survives him in excellent health. It is not a pleasant study, Watson. Here was a man who had made a very great deal of money, and had made it by lending small sums to desperate persons at ruinous interest, and by buying up the debts of others in order to enforce them with a rigor the original creditor would have shrunk from. He held at his death the paper of I know not how many tradesmen, actors, and small gentlemen about the Strand. He owned, as Lestrade told us, a controlling interest in the Corinthian theatre itself. And he was, by every account I have gathered, a man wholly without mercy, one who foreclosed upon the widow as readily as upon the spendthrift, who had driven more than one debtor to ruin, and at least one, they say, to the river. If we are to look for persons who wished Bartholomew Crail dead, Watson, we shall not want for candidates. The difficulty, as Lestrade so justly observed, will be the other one. Of all the many who wished it, which had the knowledge and the opportunity and the nerve to do this particular and peculiar thing. The knowledge above all, said I. For whoever did it must have known the theatre intimately, the boxes, the forgotten door, the exact moment of the shot in the play. Precisely. You improve, Watson. That single consideration sweeps away 9/10 of our candidates at a stroke. Crail's ruined debtors in the city, however bitter their hatred, could have known nothing of a sealed door in a stage box or the cue for a pistol shot in the second act. No, our man is of the theatre. He is one of that small company of persons to whom the Corinthian is a familiar place, its players, its managers, its servants. Let us consider them. And consider them we did over the days that followed, and I shall set down here the several persons upon whom, in turn, the shadow of suspicion fell. For it is in the rise and fall of these suspicions that the true interest of the case, to my mind, resides. The first, inevitably, was Miss Eleanor Vane herself. It was Lestrade who fixed upon her, and I could not at the outset think him wholly wrong, for there was a dreadful aptness in it. She had held a pistol in her hand, or rather her fellow player had, but she had been upon the stage at the very side of the action at the moment of the shot. And when Lestrade, pursuing this notion, made inquiry into her circumstances, he came upon a fact that seemed for a day or two to settle the matter. Miss Vane, it appeared, was among the debtors of Bartholomew Crail. She had borrowed of him some 2 years before a considerable sum to meet, it was said, the debts of a brother who had since gone abroad, and Crail had held the bond over her, and had of late, by the testimony of her dresser, been pressing her for payment in a manner that had reduced her more than once to tears. Here, then, was motive in abundance. But Holmes shook his head over it from the first. The pistol upon the stage fired a blank charge, Watson. That is not in dispute, and a dozen persons have handled it. Miss Vane could not have fired the fatal shot from the stage, in full view of 1,000 people, with a weapon that carried no ball. And as to the notion that she crept away and did it through the wall, consider. She was upon the stage, in the full glare of the lights, before the eyes of the whole house, at the very instant of the shot. There is no alibi in the world so perfect as that. Whatever else Miss Vane may be, she is not our murderer. The debt gives her a motive, but a motive without an opportunity is a lock without a key. Let us keep her in mind, but let us not deceive ourselves. I called upon Miss Vane myself in the course of the inquiry, at Holmes's request, for he had a theory, which I have remarked upon before, that a woman will often say to a plain, sympathetic medical man what she would never say to a policeman, and that I was, in his phrase, a good deal more useful in a lady's drawing-room than he was himself. She received me in her dressing-room at the Corinthian, upon an afternoon 2 days after the murder, a small, cluttered, ill-lit chamber that smelt of grease-paint and gas and stale flowers, its walls thick with the yellowed bills and portraits of a life spent upon the stage. She was without her paint, and looked older and plainer and more human than she had looked across the footlights, and there were shadows beneath her eyes that spoke of nights ill slept. "You have come from Mr. Holmes," said she, before I had well begun, "and Mr. Holmes wishes to know whether I murdered Bartholomew Crale." "Well, doctor, you may sit down, and I will tell you what I told the inspector, and you may make of it what you please. I owed the man money. I do not deny it. How should I, when the police have had it out of my banker and my dresser and half of London by now? I borrowed of him 2 years ago, to save my brother from a debt that would have disgraced us both, and my brother took the money and went to Cape Town and has not written me a line since, and I have been paying Crale's interest ever since out of my salary, and it has been like feeding a fire that will not be filled. He came to me a fortnight ago in this very room, and stood where you are standing, and told me that if I had not £200 for him by Christmas, he would have me in the bankruptcy court, and see that I never played a London stage again. That is the man you ask me to grieve for." "I do not ask you to grieve for him, Miss Vane," said I gently. "I ask only whether you can help us to find who killed him." She looked at me for a moment, and something in my face seemed to disarm her, for her hard tone softened. "You are a kind man, doctor." "Watson, I see it, and it is a rarer thing than you suppose in the people who come asking me questions. No, I cannot help you. I wish to God I could, for whoever did this thing did me a service, and I would not see him hang for it. But I know nothing. I was upon the stage when the shot was fired. The whole house saw me there, with my hands flung out, playing the fool over a make-believe duel while a real murder was doing not 20 feet from me. If that is not an alibi, I do not know what an honest woman must do to prove herself innocent." She laughed, a short, mirthless laugh. "The pistol Mr. Harker fired at me in the play carried nothing but powder and wadding. Old Penrose loads it himself every night, and there is not a ball in the building that I ever heard of. You may ask him." I said that I did not doubt her, and I spoke the truth, for there was in her manner, beneath the theatrical polish and the bitterness, a note of genuine and weary honesty that I found it hard to mistrust. We talked a little longer, of Crale and of the theatre, and of the manager, Mr. Farrow, of whom she spoke with a warmth that I remarked. A gentleman, doctor, and a scholar, and the only one of them who ever treated us players as though we were Christian souls and not cattle. And then I rose to take my leave. And it was as I was going, with my hand already upon the door, that she said a thing which I did not at the time understand the weight of, and that I reported to Holmes only because I had formed the habit of reporting to him everything, however trifling it seemed. "You may tell your friend Mr. Holmes," said she, with a tired smile, "that if he wishes to find persons who hated Bartholomew Crail, he need not confine himself to those Crail ruined. He should look also to those Crail meant to ruin, and had not yet. There is a difference, Doctor. A man who is already ruined has, in a manner of speaking, nothing left to lose, and such a man weeps or drinks or dies. It is the man who sees his ruin coming towards him, and has still something he loves that he might yet save. It is that man you should fear." I repeated this to Holmes, and he heard it in silence, and then said only, "A perceptive woman. Remember what she has told you, Watson." She has, I think without knowing it, described our man. Before I pass to the second of our suspects, I must set down a small episode which, though it advanced our knowledge of no single person, did more than anything else to confirm Holmes in the theory of the crime that he had formed from the very first, for it turned what had been an inference into a certainty, and it did so through the one witness in all that great audience who had heard the truth with a trained and understanding ear. Holmes had said to me, upon the morning after the murder, that he wished to find, if such a person existed, someone who had consciously remarked the doubling of the report. You and I heard it, Watson, and dismissed it, being occupied with the play. But there are ears in this world better schooled than ours, and if there was in that house one person whose whole life is the discrimination of sounds, that person may have heard what we did not permit ourselves to hear. And with this in view, he had sought out the orchestra of the Corinthian, and in particular its leader, a first violin by the name of Kettner, a German by birth, a small, precise, gray-bearded man who had spent 35 years in the pits of London theaters, and who received us in his lodgings in Soho amid a clutter of music and instruments with the grave courtesy of the old-fashioned professional musician. Holmes came to his purpose without preamble. "Herr Kettner, I am told that upon the night of the death at the Corinthian you were in your accustomed place, leading the band, through the whole of the second act." "That is so, sir." "To the very end. That is, to the end of the duel scene, when the tragedy was discovered and the curtain rung down. Then you were within a few feet of the stage box in which the gentleman died, and nearer still to the stage upon which the pistol was fired. I wish to ask you a single question, and I beg you to consider it carefully before you answer, for a great deal may hang upon it. When the pistol was fired in the duel scene, did the report seem to you in any way unusual?" The old man's face changed at once. He set down the bow he had been holding, and looked at Holmes with a new attention. "You are the first person who has asked me that," said he slowly, "and I had begun to think that I should never be asked, and that I had imagined it. Yes, sir. It was unusual. I have heard that pistol fired upon 100 nights, always the same, one flat report, so." He clapped his hands once sharply. "But upon that night it was not one. It was two. Not two shots one after another, you understand. Not asterisk bang bang asterisk, but two together, so close that another man would have heard but one, the second falling within the first, a little fuller, a little deeper, as when two players sound the same note and one is a hair behind the other, so that the ear is troubled and cannot say why. I turned my head, I looked at the stage. There was but the one pistol smoking in Mr. Harker's hand, and I said to myself, Kettner, you are growing old and your ears deceive you. And I thought no more of it, until the next morning when I heard that a man had been shot dead in the box beside me. And then, sir, I grew cold all over, for I understood that I had heard the shot that killed him, and had taken it for an echo. There was a silence in the little room. Holmes rose, and I saw that quiet light in his eye that told me he had got what he came for. Herr Kettner, said he, you have the best pair of ears in London, and you have rendered a service to justice that 100 sharper-eyed men could not have rendered. What you took for an echo was the truth, and what 1,000 others took for the play was a murder. I am obliged to you more than I can say. We came away, and in the street Holmes turned to me with the air of a man who has locked the last bolt of a door. There it is, Watson, out of the mouth of a witness no counsel on earth could shake. 2 reports fired as one. The mechanism of the thing is now beyond dispute. It remains only to find the hand. And that hand, I am now very sure, we shall find not among those who merely hated Crail, but among those who both hated him and knew this theater to its bones. But we must be thorough. There are others who have been named, and we must dispose of them in their turn, if only to satisfy Lestrade, who is at this moment, I do not doubt, building a scaffold for the wrong man. The second upon whom suspicion fell was a certain Captain Nathaniel Rourke, and the manner of his coming under it was as follows. It was established by inquiry among the theater servants that the late Mr. Crail had of recent months been much estranged from his wife, for Crail had a wife, a Mrs. Isolde Crail, a woman a full 20 years his junior, whom he had married 3 years before and whom, by all accounts, he had treated with the same cold contempt he showed to all the world. Mrs. Crail, it appeared, had of late been often in the company of this Captain Rourke, a handsome, idle, personable man about town, and the connection had been remarked, and had come to Crail's ears, and there had been, some weeks before the murder, a violent scene between the 2 men in the lobby of a club, of which several persons had been witness. Moreover, and it was this that gave the matter its edge, Captain Rourke had been present at the Corinthian on the night of the murder. He had sat not in a box but in the stalls, upon the opposite side of the house from Crail's box, and Mrs. Crail, it was learned, had been expected but had not come, having sent word that she was unwell. Here, then, was a second candidate, with a motive of a warmer and more human kind than the mere hatred of a creditor, jealousy, and thwarted love, and a wife who would be free, and a fortune that would come to that wife upon her husband's death. Lestrade, abandoning Miss Vane, took up the scent of Captain Rourke with all the ardor of a man who feels he has lost time to make up. And I will own that for a day I thought he might be right. We called together, Holmes and I upon the widow at the house in a somber square off the Bayswater Road that had been Crayle's. A heavy, over-furnished house, dark with plush and mahogany, that seemed the very image of its late master's cold prosperity. Mrs. Isolde Crayle received us in a drawing-room where the blinds were half drawn, as custom required, and where she sat very upright in her new black, a young and undeniably beautiful woman, pale, composed, with a still, guarded face out of which two dark eyes watched us with a wariness that all her composure could not quite conceal. And she was not alone, for standing at the window with the air of a man who has a right to be there and yet is not easy in it, was a tall, well-made, florid gentleman whom Holmes greeted, before any introduction, by name. "Captain Rourke, I think. It is convenient that we should find you here. It spares us a second call." The captain colored and drew himself up. "I am a friend of Mrs. Crayle's, sir, and I am here to support her in a very trying hour. I hope there is nothing improper in that." "Nothing whatever," said Holmes smoothly, "provided the friendship be an old one." "Is it an old one, Captain?" There was a silence. Mrs. Crayle's white hands tightened a little in her lap, but her voice, when she spoke, was steady and low. "You need not fence with us, Mr. Holmes. I know why you have come, and I know what is said, that the captain and I are more to one another than we should be, and that between us we contrived my husband's death to be free and to have his money. It is what the police believe. I have seen it in that little inspector's face. Well, I will tell you the truth, and you may believe it or not as you choose, for I am too tired to care greatly which. Yes, I loved my husband once, or thought I did. I was 22 and he was rich, and my family was poor, and I was sold to him as surely as a horse is sold at a fair, though we called it a marriage. And I have been unhappy every day of the 3 years since, for he was a hard and a cold and a jealous man who begrudged me every friend and every pleasure, and used me at the last, as he used everyone, as a thing that was his. And yes, Captain Rourke has been kind to me, when no one else was kind, and I will not pretend to you or to anyone that I am sorry my husband is dead. But I did not kill him. Neither did the captain. We are guilty of nothing worse than of wishing, in our hearts, for a thing that another hand has done. And if that is a crime, Mr. Holmes, then hang half the unhappy wives in London, and their friends with them. It was spoken with a bitter dignity that moved me, and I glanced at Holmes, but his face gave nothing away. "On the night your husband died, madam," said he, "you were expected at the theater and did not come. May I ask why?" "Because I could not endure another evening in that box, sitting beside him under the eyes of the house like a jewel he had bought. I sent word that I was ill. It was not wholly untrue. I was sick of him and of my life. I stayed at home, and my maid was with me the whole evening, and she will tell you so. And you, Captain, you went to the theater, though Mrs. Crayle did not. That was, shall we say, hopeful of you." Rourke's flush deepened. "I did not know she would not come until I was there. I had taken a seat in the stalls, thinking I might at least see her. When I learned she was not in the box, I stayed for the play. I was in my seat the whole of the second act. The people about me will tell you so. I never stirred. I give you my word as a gentleman, Mr. Holmes, that I know no more of how Crail died than you do. Less, I dare say. Your word as a gentleman, Holmes repeated, without irony, is a security I shall be able to verify, which is all that I require of it. I think, madam, we need not trouble you longer. He rose and bowed, and at the door he turned. You have been frank with me, Mrs. Crail, and I will be frank with you in return. I do not think you killed your husband, and I do not think the captain killed him. And I will add, since I am a plain-spoken man, that when this dreadful business is done and a decent time is past, I hope you may both of you find the happiness that has been so long denied you. Good day. In the street, I asked him whether he had meant it, or whether it was a device to loosen their tongues. He walked some way in silence before he answered. I meant it, Watson. I have hunted a great many people in my time, and I have learned to tell the guilty from the merely unfortunate, and those two are among the unfortunate. She is a woman sold into a wretched marriage, and he is a rather foolish, rather idle man who fell in love with her, and they have wished a wicked wish, as thousands do who never lift a finger to make it true. No. Whoever fired that shot was neither the wife who would not enter the box, nor the lover who sat in full view of 100 witnesses. But it was worth the call, if only to see them, for I have now looked into the faces of everyone whom the world has thought of, and I am the more certain that the world has thought of the wrong people. But again it was Holmes who cooled the pursuit, when Lestrade, undeterred, pressed on with the case against Rourke. He had made his own inquiries, and he laid them before us with his usual economy. Captain Rourke, said he, is a scoundrel, a fortune hunter, and very possibly a coward. He had every motive to wish Crail in his grave, and I do not doubt that he wished it heartily. But he did not do this. Consider the opportunity, Watson, always the opportunity. Rourke sat in the stalls, upon the far side of the house, in full view of his neighbors, throughout the second act. 3 separate persons whom I have questioned recall him in his seat during the duel scene. 1, a lady beside whom he sat, is positive he did not stir. He could no more have been in that empty box, freeing a forgotten door and firing through a wall, than he could have been upon the moon. And there is this further point, which is, to my mind, decisive. Captain Rourke knew nothing whatever of the interior arrangements of the Corinthian. He was a patron, an occasional visitor. He had never, so far as I can discover, been behind its curtains or into its private places in his life. The man who did this thing knew the theater as a surgeon knows the body. Rourke is a red herring, Lestrade, a fine, high-smelling one, but a herring for all that. Lestrade, who had come round to Baker Street that evening full of his new theory, was not to be so easily turned from it, and I confess that his obstinacy, misguided as it was, had a certain logic that I could not at once refute. He sat forward in his chair, ticking off his points upon his fingers with the air of a man laying down a hand of cards he believes unbeatable. "That's all very well, Mr. Holmes, and very clever, but you'll forgive me if I stick to what I can put before a jury. Here's a man, Rourke, who quarreled with the deceased in public not a month ago, who's in love with the deceased's wife, who stands to see her rich and free the moment her husband's dead, and who's actually in the theater on the very night with his own 2 feet. Motive and to spare. As for his being seen in his seat, well, sir, seats empty and fill in a dark house, and people's memories of an evening at the play are not what I'd care to hang a case on the other way. A clever man might slip out and slip back, and who's to swear to the minute?" "Who indeed?" said Holmes pleasantly. "Let us suppose it, Lestrade. Let us suppose your captain rises from his seat in the stalls, in the middle of the second act, under the eyes of his neighbors, makes his way, how? Round to the far side of the house, passes the attendant Tibbet who swears no one passed him, lets himself into a locked and empty box of whose very existence, as an approach to Crail, he can have known nothing since he had never in his life been behind these curtains, discovers in the dark and in the 2 minutes at his disposal a sealed door that the theater's own people had forgotten for a generation, frees it of its paint, opens it without sound, and fires through it at the and then makes his way back to his seat, and is remarked there again, all within the space of a single scene. Tell me, Lestrade, is that the picture of a jealous captain acting upon a sudden passion, or is it the picture of a man who knew this theater as he knows his own name, and who had prepared every step of it for weeks?" Lestrade's fingers stopped their ticking. He opened his mouth and shut it again. "You see the difficulty," Holmes went on more gently. "It is not motive that we want, my dear Lestrade. Motive is the commonest thing in the world, and half of London had motive against Bartholomew Crail. It is the peculiar, the specialized, the intimate knowledge that the crime required. Whoever did this thing knew of the sealed door, knew the cue for the shot to the instant, knew that the box beside Crail's could be kept empty and unremarked, and knew how to have Tibbet drawn from his post at the one moment that mattered. There are not 5 people in the world who possessed all that knowledge, and Captain Rourke is assuredly not among them. Arrest him if you must, but you will have to let him go again, and you will have lost a week, and warned the man we want that the hunt is up. I would counsel patience." "And I suppose," said Lestrade, with a touch of sourness, "that you know already who the man we want is." Holmes gazed into the fire for a moment before he answered. "I have a notion," said he, "but a notion is not a case, and I will not name a man to you until I can hand you the rope entire, and not a strand of it wanting. Give me 2 days, Lestrade. Only leave your captain in peace, and give me 2 days." There was that in his voice which even Lestrade had learned, through long and grudging experience, not to gainsay, and he went away at last unconvinced but restrained, and the pursuit of Captain Rourke was, to my private relief, allowed to lapse. And it was in those 2 days that Holmes turned his attention, quietly and without a word, to the police, to the third and last of the persons who come into this history, and it was a name that came to us almost by accident, and yet it was the name that mattered. I have kept it for the last, as Holmes kept it, for it was upon this man that the whole truth at length converged. His name was Lucius Farrow, and he was the manager, more exactly, the lessee manager, of the Corinthian Theatre. He was the very man in evening dress who had first appealed to me for help on the night of the murder, when Crayle's body was found, and I had carried away from that first meeting an impression of a courteous, cultivated, deeply distressed gentleman of perhaps 45, a man of the theatre to his fingertips, grieved and horrified that so dreadful a thing should have befallen within his house. He had been, throughout the inquiry, the most helpful of all the theatre people, ever at hand, ever ready with information, sparing no pains to assist the police, and it was perhaps for this very reason that suspicion had passed him by. A man so patently anxious to see the murderer caught does not readily suggest himself as the murderer. Moreover, and this was the point that seemed at first to place Farrow altogether beyond suspicion, it was hard to see what Farrow could have gained by Crayle's death, and easy to see what he stood to lose. For it was well known that Crayle, as principal proprietor of the theatre, had held Farrow's fortunes in the hollow of his hand, and it was reasoned by Lestrade and by others that a man in Farrow's dependent position would have every motive to keep his proprietor alive and none to kill him, since a dead creditor's estate is administered by executors who know no mercy at all, and the death of Crayle could only bring the whole weight of the debt crashing down upon Farrow's head the sooner. It was this very argument, the argument that seemed to clear Farrow, that first drew Holmes's attention to him. "It is too neat, Watson," he said to me, one evening as we sat over the fire. "Everyone tells me that Farrow could have no motive, because Crayle's death must ruin him. And it is a good argument, and it is the argument a clever man would wish to have made for him. But I have learned to distrust the man for whom too good an argument is made. Let us look a little closer at Mr. Lucius Farrow, and at the exact state of his affairs, before we accept that he had nothing to gain." And Holmes did look closer, and what he found over the following 2 days altered the whole complexion of the case. He found, first, that the relation between Farrow and Crayle had been of long standing and of a peculiar bitterness. The Corinthian Theatre had been founded 40 years before by Farrow's own father, a well-loved actor-manager of the old school, and had been the pride and the whole life of the family. But the elder Farrow had died, leaving the theatre encumbered with debt, and the son, taking it up, had struggled for years to keep it afloat. And in this struggle he had turned in an evil hour to Bartholomew Crayle. Crayle had advanced the money, but Crayle, in the manner of such men, had advanced it in such a way as to acquire, little by little, a controlling share in the theatre itself, until Lucius Farrow found that the house his father had built, and that he loved as a man loves his home and his history, was in truth no longer his own, but was held at the will and pleasure of a moneylender who cared nothing for it save as a property that might one day be sold to advantage. He found, second, and this was the graver matter, that Crayle had of late formed exactly such a design. Holmes, by inquiries whose channels he did not disclose to me, established beyond doubt that in the weeks before his death Crail had been in secret negotiation with a syndicate of speculators who wished to acquire the Corinthian, not to continue it as a theater, but to pull it down, for the ground upon which it stood, in that improving quarter of the Strand, had grown enormously in value, and was wanted for the building of offices and shops. Crail stood to make a very great sum by the transaction, and it required only that he should exercise his power as principal proprietor to close the theater, dismiss its company, and hand over the site, a thing he had every intention of doing, and had all but done. Lucius Farrow was to lose, at a stroke, the theater, his livelihood, and the whole meaning and inheritance of his life. And he found, third and last, and it was this that made all the rest into a hangman's rope, the matter of the money. In his long and desperate struggle to keep the Corinthian alive, Farrow had done a thing that many a better man has done in like extremity, and that the law does not forgive. He had, over some years, quietly and steadily made free with moneys that were not his to use, the takings of the house, sums held in trust, the small investments of one or two who had put money into the enterprise on his personal assurance. He had done it, I do not doubt, always meaning to repay, always believing that the next great success would set all straight, and always the debt had deepened. And Bartholomew Crail had discovered it. Crail, with the papers in his possession that proved it, the very papers, as I need hardly say, that had lain in the flat leather dispatch case upon the little table in the box, and that were gone when Holmes examined it. Crail had held over Farrow not merely the loss of the theater, but exposure, disgrace, and a felon's cell. He had, in the phrase Miss Vane had used to me, without knowing how truly she spoke, meant to ruin a man who had still something he loved that he might yet save. And that man had seen his ruin coming towards him, and had struck. "You perceive now, Watson," said Holmes, when he had laid all this before me, "how completely the argument that seemed to clear Farrow in fact condemns him. It was said that Crail's death must ruin Farrow, since the estate would foreclose. But that overlooked the papers. So long as those papers existed, and were in Crail's hands, Farrow was a lost man whether Crail lived or died. His one hope of safety lay not merely in Crail's death, but in the destruction of the evidence Crail carried. And that is precisely what the murderer did. He killed Crail, yes, but he also emptied the dispatch case. He took the papers, and in the taking of them he told us, as plainly as if he had signed his name, that his motive was not the vulgar one of a debtor destroying his creditor, but the deeper one of a doomed man seizing back, in a single desperate act, the proof of his own crime. It was the empty case, Watson, that hanged Lucius Farrow. A man who kills for hatred leaves the room. A man who kills to recover a paper takes the paper. And there was but one man in the world to whom that particular paper was worth a murder. There remained, however, the matter of the opportunity, and here Holmes had been at equal pains, for it was not enough to show that Farrow had the motive and the knowledge, the intimate knowledge of the theater, the sealed door, the cue for the pistol shot, which of all men he possessed most completely. It was necessary to show that he had had the chance, and the difficulty was that Pharaoh, on the night of the murder, had been, by the testimony of many, very much in evidence about the front of the house, greeting patrons, moving among the lobbies, visible to a dozen witnesses. It was this apparent ubiquity that had helped to shield him. But Holmes, patiently gathering the accounts of the theater servants and matching them one against another, had found the gap. For a space of some 10 or 12 minutes in the course of the second act, the very minutes that embraced the duel scene, no one could be found who had seen Mr. Pharaoh at all. He had been visible before. He was visible again after. But in that critical interval he had, upon his own account, been in his office, going over the night's accounts, and no living soul could be produced to confirm it. More than this, it was Pharaoh himself, Holmes discovered, who had given the order that the empty box adjoining Crale's was to be kept empty and unlit that night. A small thing, easily overlooked, explained away as a matter of some repair to the fittings. And it was Pharaoh who, some days before, had been observed by a cleaner to be seeing to something behind the curtain at the rear of that same box, though the woman had thought nothing of it, the manager being forever about the house upon one. And it was Pharaoh, finally, who had the arranging of the theater's little affairs, and who could, without exciting the least remark, have contrived that the attendant Tibbet should be called up to the gallery, to deal with a disturbance at just the moment when his post before the boxes had best be left unwatched. "Every thread runs to the same hand, Watson," said Holmes. "The knowledge, the motive, the opportunity, the empty box, the freed door, the summoning away of the attendant, the emptied case. Singly, each might be explained. Together, they form a rope that no jury in England will refuse to draw tight. It remains only to make certain of the last link, the pistol, and for that we must go once more to the Corinthian. We went that same afternoon, and Holmes's first business was with the stage itself, and with the old propertyman, Silas Penrose, in whose keeping were all the properties of the play, and the dueling pistol among them. Penrose was a bent, wheezing, white-whiskered veteran of the theater who had loaded stage pistols, as he told us with some pride, since before Holmes was breeched, and he produced the weapon for our inspection with the air of a man defending a friend against a slander. "This is the pistol, sir, and there's no harm in it, whatever they may say. A great old-fashioned single-barreled thing, see the bore of it, wide as your thumb. I charge it myself, every night of my life, with powder and a good wad of paper on top, and never a ball nor anything like a ball comes near it, for where would be the sense, with Mr. Harker firing it straight at Miss Vane not 10 feet off? It goes off with a fine loud bang and a deal of smoke, and that is the whole of its wickedness. You may examine it as you please." Holmes did examine it minutely, and passed it to me, and I could see for myself that the great smooth bore had never carried a rifled ball, and that the sound Miss Vane had heard flung at her nightly was, as she had said, no more than powder and paper. "So much for the stage," said Holmes. "The weapon that made the noise could not have made the wound, and the weapon that made the wound made almost no noise at all, being masked by the other. Now, Watson, the ball itself." The ball had been recovered. It had passed through the unhappy Crail and lodged in the wooden paneling of the box behind him, and Lestrade had it. It was a small thing, sadly flattened, but Holmes turned it under his lens with great care. "You perceive, Watson, that this is no such ball as that great horse pistol could have thrown, even had it been charged with one. This is a small ball, of a pattern used in the pocket revolvers that a man may carry in his coat and no one be the wiser. The sort of weapon, in short, that a gentleman keeps in a drawer against burglars and forgets that he possesses. Fix that in your mind. We are looking for a small revolver in the hands of a man who could stand within a few feet of Crail's back. I could speak to the matter with some little authority of my own, for I had been present, at Holmes's desire, when the police surgeon made his examination of the body, and had looked upon the wound with a professional eye. It bore out my friend's reasoning in every particular. The ball had entered a little below and behind the left shoulder, ranging forward and somewhat upward to the heart, so that death must have been all but instantaneous. And about the point of entry, upon the fine linen of the shirt and upon the skin beneath, there lay that faint gray stippling of scorched powder grains, which any surgeon knows for the unmistakable sign of a shot delivered at very close quarters, within, at the most, a foot. A man fired upon from across a chamber carries no such mark. It is graven only when the muzzle is all but laid against the cloth. I said as much to Holmes, and added that the neatness of the wound spoke, as he had said, for no great charge, but for one of those small pocket weapons that make little noise and less smoke. "You confirm me, Watson," said he, "and you tell me more besides. Weigh what that scorching signifies." Our man did not fire from any distance at all. He leaned in through the open door until the pistol was within a hand's breadth of Crail's back, so near that a stranger seated 3 feet off must have felt the very concussion of it and cried aloud. Yet no one cried aloud, for there was no stranger. The box beyond was empty, kept empty of set purpose, and the one small report that might, even so, have betrayed him was swallowed whole, at the half-second he had chosen, by the louder folly upon the stage. He turned the flattened ball once more beneath his lens, and returned it to its envelope with the care of a man handling a relic. And with that he led me at last into the empty box adjoining the dead man's, the box from which, as he had divined upon the very night, the shot had come. It was the twin of Crail's own, crimson-hung and dim, and Holmes went over it as I had seen him go over 100 scenes, upon his hands and knees with his lens, saying nothing, while I held a candle for him. Behind its rear curtain we found the farther side of the sealed door, and here the marks of recent use were plainer even than they had been from within. The old paint scored clean away along the edge where a knife had freed it, the hinges black but their pins bright where they had been worked and oiled, and upon the very lip of the door, caught upon a splinter, a single short thread of fine black cloth, such as might have come from the sleeve of an evening coat drawn through in haste. Holmes lifted it upon the point of his knife and studied it, and laid it in an envelope without a word. Upon the floor of the box, close by the door, the boards bore the faint gray scatter of fallen plaster, and there was besides, near where a man would kneel to reach through, a small burned mark upon the carpet, a scorch no larger than a shilling, where, Holmes said, a spark or a scrap of burning wad from the muzzle had fallen and been trodden out. He knelt here, said Holmes softly, fitting himself in imagination to the place, in the dark behind the velvet, with his ear upon the play, waiting for the cue that he knew to the half-second, for he had heard it 100 nights. And when the actor upon the stage raised his arm, this man drew the old door towards him and reached through into the next box, where Crail sat with his back to the wall, all unknowing, and at the instant of the stage shot he fired, and the two reports were one. Then he drew back and closed the door, and there remained only to reach across and empty the dispatch case of the papers that were the whole purpose of the night. It was done in the space of a few seconds, Watson, in the dark, by a man who knew this theater as you know your own bedchamber. And when it was done he had but to walk out through this empty box, which he himself had ordered to be kept empty, and away, and to be seen, a few minutes after, moving among his patrons with a smile. He rose and dusted his knees, and stood looking at the little scorched mark upon the carpet with a face that had grown very grave. "And the last link, the pistol?" I asked. "The pistol we shall not find in his possession, depend upon it. A man who could plan all this would not keep the weapon by him. But we do not need it. We have the ball which tells us its kind. We have the thread which we shall match. We have the door, the dust, the scorch, the emptied case, the summoned attendant, the reserved box. And we have, above all, a man who alone possessed the knowledge to bind them together, and the motive to wish them done. I made one further inquiry as we came in, Watson, of a cleaner who has served this house these 20 years. In Mr. Farrow's office there stands an old cabinet that was his father's before him, and in that cabinet there was used to lie, among the relics of the old man, a pair of small pistols. She dusted them for years. She tells me that some weeks ago they ceased to be there, and that when she asked Mr. Farrow told her he had sent them to be cleaned. They have not come back. No, Watson, we shall not need to find the pistol. Its absence is louder than its presence could be. Come. There is one thing more to be done, and it is the hardest of all, for I must now go and tell a man that I know what he has done, and why. I shall not soon forget that last visit to the theater, upon a gray afternoon when the house was dark and empty, and the great auditorium lay hushed and dim under its Holland dust sheets, with the boxes gaping like empty eye sockets, and the whole place possessed of that peculiar melancholy that belongs to a theater out of hours, when the illusion is stripped away, and only the dusty machinery of it remains. We found Lucius Farrow in his office, a small book-lined room behind the dress circle, and he rose to receive us with the same grave courtesy he had shown throughout. And I remember thinking, as I looked at him, at the thin, sensitive, careworn face, the graying hair, the fine dark eyes in which there was so much of weariness and so little of the brute, that I had seldom seen a man who less resembled my notion of a murderer. Holmes came to the point with a directness that was almost gentle. "Mr. Farrow," said he, "I think you know why I have come. I will not insult your intelligence, which is considerable, by pretending to a doubt I do not feel. I know how Bartholomew Crail died. I know that he was shot from the empty box adjoining his own, through the old communicating door which you had, some days before, quietly freed of the paint that sealed it, that the shot was fired at the moment of the pistol shot in the second act, so that the two reports should be heard as one, that you had caused the attendant to be called away, and the adjoining box to be kept empty, against that moment, and that when the deed was done you took from the dispatch case upon the table the paper. I know why you did it. I have not come to ask you these things. I have come to tell you that I know them. There was a long silence. Pharaoh had grown very pale, but he did not start, nor bluster, nor cry out. He stood quite still behind his desk, looking at Holmes with those dark, tired eyes, and when at last he spoke it was in a low, steady voice, with a kind of quietness that was more terrible than any outcry. "You are a remarkable man, Mr. Holmes," said he. "I had heard as much. I had even, God forgive me, I had even weighed the risk of you when I saw you in the stalls that night. I told myself that no man living could unravel it. I was wrong." He drew a long breath. "You are right in every particular. I will not waste what little dignity remains to me in denying it. I killed him. I planned it for weeks, and I carried it out, and I have not slept a whole night through since. You may send for the police when you please." "There is time for that," said Holmes quietly. "Sit down, Mr. Pharaoh, and if you care to tell me the rest, the part I have had to guess at, I should be glad to hear it. I am not your judge." And Pharaoh told us, and it is his own account, given there in the dim little office with the dark theater waiting beyond the door, that I set down now to complete this record, for it supplies the one thing that all Holmes's reasoning could not supply, which is the heart of the man who did the deed. He had not, he said, meant at first to kill anyone. He had meant only to endure, as he had endured for years, the slow strangulation of the debt in the hope, the fool's hope, he called it, that some turn of fortune would yet deliver him. It was not for himself alone that he had struggled and stolen and lied. There had been a man, he told us, a friend of his youth and of his father's, one Edwin Harith, a gentle, trusting, unworldly man who had loved the Corinthian almost as Pharaoh loved it, and who had, years before, put the whole of his small fortune into the theater upon Pharaoh's personal assurance that it was safe. And it had not been safe, and when the crash came and Crail's grip tightened, it was Harith's money that was swept away with the rest. Harith had been ruined utterly. And Harith, here Pharaoh's voice, which had been steady, faltered for the first time. Harith had not borne it. He had gone down to the river one November night, a year before almost to the day, and had not come back. And it was Pharaoh who had had to identify him, and Pharaoh who carried and would carry to his own grave the knowledge that his friend had died of a trust that he, Pharaoh, had betrayed, and that Crail had exploited and turned to profit without a moment's compunction. "I could have borne my own ruin," said Pharaoh. "I think in the end I could even have borne the prison. But when I learned, as I did learn a month ago, that Crail meant to pull the theater down, that the house my father built, the house Edwin Harith died for, was to be swept away to make counting houses for the very sort of men who had destroyed us. And that Crail, having taken everything else, meant now to take even that, and to send me to jail into the bargain, so that no breath of what he had done should ever be told. Then Mr. Holmes, something in me that had held all those years gave way. I sat in this room and I looked at it all, very quietly, as a man looks at a sum in arithmetic. And I saw that there was one way, and only one, by which the papers might be destroyed and the man silenced together. And I saw that I knew this theater, every inch of it, as no other living creature knew it. And I saw the door in the wall of the box that I had known of since I was a boy playing behind the scenes, and that all the world had forgotten. And I saw the pistol in the play. And I did the sum, Mr. Holmes. I did the sum, and I acted upon it, and I have been in hell ever since. I do not ask you to pity me. I only tell you, since you have asked, that I did not do it lightly, and that I would to God it had never been done. There was a silence in the little room. I looked at Holmes, and I saw upon his face an expression I had not often surprised there, not the cold satisfaction of the hunter who has run down his quarry, but something graver and more troubled, the look of a man who has come to the end of a long pursuit and found at the end of it not a monster, but a fellow creature broken upon the wheel of his own circumstances. "Mr. Pharaoh," said he at last, "I am not, as I have told you, your judge. The law will deal with you, and the law is a blunt instrument, and takes small account of such distinctions as you and I might make. I will say only this. You did a terrible thing, and no weight of provocation can make it other than terrible. For Bartholomew Crail, whatever his cruelties, was a living man, and it was not for you to end him. That is a truth I hold to, and I will not soften it even for you. And yet I will say also that I have known murderers whom I could pursue to the scaffold, and feel that the world was the cleaner for it, and that you are not among them, and that I shall not soon forget this hour." Lucius Pharaoh bowed his head and said nothing. We gave him, at his own request, an hour before Lestrade was sent for, an hour to set his affairs in what order they might be set, and to write, I believe, certain letters. I have sometimes wondered whether Holmes, in granting that hour, did not half hope for some other issue than the one that came. But if he did, he never said so, and Pharaoh did not take the coward's way. He was arrested that evening, and made no resistance, and repeated his confession to Lestrade in the same quiet voice. And in the fullness of time he was tried, and found guilty, and, for the jury, hearing the whole miserable story, added to their verdict the strongest recommendation to mercy that I have ever known appended to such a case. His sentence was commuted from the extreme penalty to penal servitude for life. I have heard that he did not long survive it, that the same low consumption which had already, though I did not then know it, set its mark upon him, carried him off within 2 years in the infirmary of the prison, and that he met his end with the same weary composure he had shown throughout. The Corinthian theatre was pulled down within the 12-month, as Crail had designed, and there stands now upon its site a tall building of offices, past which I sometimes walk of an evening, and before which I never fail to pause a moment and to remember. Holmes and I spoke of the affair but once again, some weeks after, upon a night when the fog had come down once more upon Baker Street, and we sat late over the fire. "It was the sound, Watson," he said suddenly, out of a long silence. "That was the whole of it when all is said, the sound." He had grasped this Pharaoh, the one truth that all his cleverness turned upon, that a pistol shot in a crowded theater is not heard as a pistol shot at all, but only as an incident of the play. 1,000 persons heard the ball that killed Bartholomew Crale. Not one of them knew that he had heard it. The false report upon the stage did not merely cover the true one. It transformed it, in every mind in that house, into something harmless and expected, and instantly forgotten. It is a terrible thought, is it not, that a thing may happen in the full hearing of a multitude, and yet be as secret as though it were done in a desert, if only it be made to wear the costume of the commonplace. There is a lesson in it for our whole trade, Watson. The most dangerous fact is not the one that is hidden. It is the one that is heard and disregarded. I said, for it had lain upon my conscience these many weeks, that I myself had heard it and had disregarded it, that in the very instant of the shot some soldier's memory in me had known that the report was doubled, and that I had let the knowledge go. Holmes looked at me, and there was something almost kind in the look. "Do not reproach yourself, my dear fellow," said he. "You heard truly. It was I who sat beside you with all my boasted faculties, and heard the same doubling, and thought it the acoustics of an old theater. We were both of us deceived, and by a master. There is no shame in being deceived by a master, Watson. The shame would lie only in refusing afterwards to learn from him." He knocked out his pipe and rose, and stood a moment looking into the fire. "A wasted man," he said, half to himself. "A theater that a family loved for 40 years, and a friend dead in the river, and at the last a decent, cultivated, gentle creature driven to do murder in the dark, and to sit an hour after with the blood still upon his soul and greet his patrons with a smile. And all of it, every stroke of it, the work of one greedy man who lent money at ruinous interest and thought himself, no doubt, a pillar of the city." He turned from the fire. "I do not know, Watson, that I have ever hated a dead man as I have come, in the course of this business, to hate Bartholomew Crale. But that is a luxury we are not permitted, you and I. Our concern is with the deed, and not with the desert of the man it fell upon. Come, it is late, and there is nothing to be gained by sitting up over the wickedness of the world. It will still be there in the morning." And with that he took his candle and bade me good night, and went up to his room, and I sat a while longer alone before the dying fire, listening to the muffled sounds of the fog-bound city, and thinking of a shot that 1,000 people had heard, and no one had heard at all.